Academic supports for college students with serious mental health conditions. Video series. Video 3. Accommodations for students with mental health conditions. Disabilities and the right to reasonable accommodations. What is a disability? A physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, including pursuing an education. Colleges are required by the Americans with Disabilities Amendments Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 to make reasonable accommodations for students with disabilities, including mental health conditions that cause disability. These are federal civil rights laws.
I had the opportunity to have neuropsych testing done and a 504 plan created through an educational consultant. So my process of delivering that to the Office of Disability Services was pretty seamless, which I'm fortunate for. And thankfully, every office I've worked through so far has been accommodating as those original plan accommodations were set.
Understanding reasonable accommodations. An accommodation is an alteration of environment, curriculum format, or equipment that allows an individual with a disability to gain access to content and/or complete assigned tasks. They allow students with disabilities to pursue a regular course of study. Reasonable accommodations enable individuals with disabilities to have an equal opportunity to participate in an academic program. Academic accommodations are not modifications. Modifications change what is being learned. Accommodations change how the material is learned. Accommodations are all about leveling the playing field. Colleges typically have an Office for Disability or Accessibility Services that is responsible for coordinating reasonable accommodations and supporting the needs of students with disabilities. Students with disabilities are required to apply for accommodations through the Office of Disability Services at their college or university. Based on the student's needs, accommodations may cover academics as well as campus life, such as keeping an emotional support animal.
A reasonable accommodation is a person, place, thing, or activity that sort of levels the playing ground for you in an area where you might have a deficit due to your medical condition. People with mental health conditions often use people resources as reasonable accommodations. That gives you access to the same experience as a student who doesn't have a mental health condition. So if you need someone to help you learn where all the resources are on campus, and you have someone who's a peer or mentor and they accompany you, that's can be a reasonable accommodation. Extra time on a test because you're on medications that slow your problem solving down a bit and you can't finish a calculus exam or a stats exam in 60 minutes, you need 90. That would be a reasonable accommodation. It levels the playing field so that you are not punished in any way for living with any kind of medical or mental health condition. You have the right to have the same experience as students without any of those conditions.
Common accommodations for students with mental health-based disabilities. Common student accommodations regarding testing include extended time on tests, breaks during tests, tests in distraction-free environments, or alternative testing formats. Common student accommodations regarding attendance include classroom breaks, flexible attendance, reduced course load, or providing an incomplete rather than a failure if symptom relapse occurs. Common student inside the classroom accommodations include audio recording, note-taking, preferred seating, or advance access to assignments, syllabus, and/or class materials.
I think faculty and staff can ensure that requesting accommodations is positive for students and giving them access by just eliminating any sense that it's a burden or that it's hard for them to go out of their way to assist you in these accommodations. I know I've always felt uncomfortable or less than as is needing these extra things, even if it is just a mental health condition and part of who I am. So having the faculty just be mindful of the fact that, you know, you just learn differently and this is a way to help you succeed because they too want the best for you.
Outside of the box accommodations for students with mental health-based disabilities. Colleges can offer outside of the box accommodations for students with mental health conditions. Examples include limiting or changing the way demand responses are requested, such as calling on a student only when their hand is raised. Reframing participation questions or in-class feedback, such as restating questions in clear terms. Other examples of out-of-the-box accommodations include providing advance warning or pre-processing by describing what will happen at the beginning of class, or reducing distraction, for example, enrolling students in classes with a smaller number of students.
Yeah, some examples of outside the box accommodations, I think, are things like changing the way perhaps that assignments are done, especially for those that have participation requirements. For example, I have a course that's a discussion-based course, and it's a vast majority of the graded component of the course is revolves around participation, and yet the class is still fairly large. We divide it up, but we might have 30 students in the section, and it's can be very challenging for people to participate when they feel anxious. And so one of the things I've tried to do is have a written assignment that's due days before the class time that involves the topic of discussion, so that they submit the written assignment and they know that that's what I'm reading and preparing for the class. And so that if they're asked to participate or if I bring something up, it's something that they've written about, so that then it's something they've already processed and they're not trying to process in that exact moment where they're trying to participate. Of course, sometimes the discussion goes off into different directions, but when that happens, I don't usually call on someone specific. I ask them, who's willing to add to it. So giving people, I think, that heads up of what they might be asked to contribute about, or let them contribute in multiple ways, is one example of it outside the box. I think another example is, as I was mentioning in one of the other questions, that grouping students together who might already be aware of the situation and supportive of that individual when and if that's possible. I know sometimes it's not. People, might need to prepare to be interactive with a variety of people, but if you're subgrouping the class and someone has a mental health condition and they identify with you that there's a group who are already supportive of them, it's great to be able to let them establish that group as part of who they're working with.
So a few out of the box examples of accommodations that I have utilized in my classrooms to support students with mental health needs include, I actually try every single semester that I teach to to some extent assume that mental health considerations and accommodations are going to be needed. And so in that sense, I actually try and structure my class and build my syllabus in such a way that these things are kind of actually baked into the class. And I just want to take a little bit of time to explain why I do that. And it's because I think one of the biggest hurdles for our students is actually reaching out for help. And so in a sense, if the structures are already in place and they don't need to, I feel like we have more chance of actually reaching the students who really, really need the help. And so one example, I don't know how out of the box this is, but one of the things that I really always try and do is build multiple options into my syllabus. So as a very small example of that, particularly for really heavily weighted assignments for the final, for example, I always try and give students different options for how they want to do their final. So as a very simple example of that, I always at least give them an option to sit an exam or to write a paper. Yes, that does mean more work for me because I have to devise different questions and so on and so forth. But I really do feel that at the end of the day, providing options like that really allows our students to play to their strengths.
Raising awareness about disability accommodations. Faculty can raise awareness of the accommodations process by advising students to submit paperwork before a course begins, announcing resources about learning differences on the first day of class, referring students to the Office of Disability Services, or encouraging students to look into services and accommodations even if they are not sure they need them.
Because I know at the beginning for me, I had to build up the courage to ask for accommodations. It was scary at the beginning. I was, coming from a place of, for asking for accommodations, being seen as weak or being seen as not good enough or being seen as getting a leg up on everybody else. It took a lot for me to request those accommodations. And I think that sometimes if there could be any education or training on the faculty's behalf of perhaps saying a word or two at the beginning of the semester to the class, saying, if ever you feel like you need an accommodation, feel free to let me know. So that way there's not so much of a barrier. And it's been communicated to students that, hey, I'm open to receiving those accommodations, and I'm not going to, reject them. I'm not going to see them in any type of way. I'm open to receiving them. And I think that type of communication would have allowed me to not have to be as brave, if that makes sense.
Confidentiality. Unless a student chooses to disclose their specific disability to you as a faculty member, you are not entitled to the specifics of this information. Faculty members only need to know the present impact of an unnamed disability on a student's functioning in their course.
So the schools are extremely respectful of the laws that govern student confidentiality. There's FERPA and there's HIPAA, and that means that health information is protected, and so is your academic information protected. When students come to college campuses, there's a little box when they've been admitted about whether or not they're going to allow their parents, once they're over 18, to see any of their information. And schools really respect that. So the only time any family member or parent is called is if someone has become really gravely ill or has been hospitalized or hurt. So students can, I think, rest assured, if they don't want their family to know what's going on, that their families aren't going to know what's going on. And certainly when a reasonable accommodation is given to a faculty or staff member, they're not told the reason why. They're just told that students have been granted an accommodation for extra time on an exam, or they need to be able to take an exam in a quiet room. That's all the professors know.
Reflect on: what can you do to raise the awareness of students with mental health-based disabilities regarding their rights to reasonable accommodations? How can you adapt your classroom practices to offer reasonable accommodations to students with mental health-based disabilities in your classroom? What can you do to show support to a student who approaches you about accommodations? The next video in this series will address informal accommodations. Transitions ACR would like to thank the students, faculty members, and experts who shared their experience and expertise.